So, yeah, I was really interested when you reached out to me because it's true. I interview guests. I started this podcast because I was diagnosed at the age of 45. And so I looked back at the span of my life through motherhood and university and babies. And it was just like ADHD everywhere. Right.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so, yeah, like I have a tendency to interview a lot of women who are in the same position as me. Oh, and perimenopause. Like it's just, this whole long
Totally.
laundry list of all of these ways in which it manifests itself. And so I love whenever I hear, women in their 20s are listening to the podcast and relating too, because I feel like it's my gift to you, right? I'm like, if you can avoid the 20 years of depression and anxiety and questioning that some of us went through, I feel like that would be so wonderful. So when you reached out to me and you were like, I feel like generationally there's a lot of interesting, I feel like you have a lot of thoughts and I want to hear about them because I think
Yeah.
it is super interesting to kind of find out what it's like. I have had guests who were diagnosed in their 20s, but just sort of what it's
Mm-hmm.
like in the moment and also with what we know. Because often when I interview women who were diagnosed either in childhood or in high school or in even in their 20s, that was 20 years ago. And it
Yep.
still felt like even if you were diagnosed, it didn't matter because nobody knew anything about ADHD or what it looked like in women.
Mm-hmm.
And we're only just really coming to like an explosion in terms of our understanding about what it is and
Yep.
what it
No,
looks
for
like
sure.
and how different it is for women and men.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so I can't wait. So let's get started. First of all,
Thank you.
I want to hear about your diagnosis and
Yeah,
when you were diagnosed and kind of what was going on for you that led you to think maybe this is ADHD.
for sure. There's like, I know, I feel like for all of us, there's like so much to it. It's hard to even get it into one kind of snapshot. But yeah, like you were saying, so I'm 25 now. I was diagnosed when I was 24. It's been interesting for sure growing up like undiagnosed. And I think actually really the most interesting thing is that I have two younger brothers. One of them is 2 years younger than me, and he was diagnosed pretty much right off the bat when he was like, I don't know, 12. He started having a lot of like academic problems, and it just was like, all right, let's get him tested. Let's do all this stuff. And I mean, in a lot of ways, like he is and was like the stereotype of like, when you say, oh, you get this ADHD diagnosis, you think of the little boy climbing around on the walls. Like that was never me. That was my brother. So, it was pretty easy, I guess, to just see that and be like for the people around us, for students, or sorry, for teachers around us and like our kind of community to just be like, oh, yep, done ADHD. And then like I kind of was 2 years older. I did not get any of that recognition or like awareness really at all until I kind of sought it out on my own when I was really struggling at a later time in my life. But yeah, it's been definitely interesting. So I actually in high school, well, I should go back a bit. I have always been told, oh, you're so smart, like you're so capable, you're so this and that. And I've always in a way like known that, but I've also never really felt like I've been successful in the ways that I want to be successful. And I've like never really been a good student academically, like just not, in a way that I think when you like talk to neurotypical people and you're like, oh, I wasn't a good student. They're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like we all get it. No, like I was really not a good student. Like, I don't think y'all know what I'm saying. So yeah, I just was really struggling in school, but I always kind of got by. Like I don't know if it's because of my gender. I don't know if it's because I was like just kind of more quiet and reserved, where I kind of flew under the radar in a lot of ways that I was struggling. Honestly, in middle school, I started like copying homework off of my peers and like really just kind of trying to get through in whatever way that I could without like letting anyone know that like I mean, I didn't even know I was struggling. I just couldn't do it. I just was like, I'm trying to keep doing these things that everybody says you have to do to be successful. And like, I didn't know how to do that. So I was just trying to figure it out kind of the best way that I could always. And, it's so funny because like looking back, I totally would sit in class and like talk to like the boy next to me. And then the teacher would come around and be like, hey, like, James, stop talking. Like, you're distracting Raegan. And it was like very often that they would not see me as like the troublemaker kind of, because I was generally pretty quiet and reserved, but then I'd be like bouncing off the walls, like talking to the students next to me, but they wouldn't expect it. So that was kind of interesting always. And, there's like 100 examples of things that I messed up and didn't like succeed in the academic world growing up. And just, I feel like I never read a single book that we were supposed to read through high school. Like I just would like listen in class when they were discussing the book report or whatever, and I would get through somehow, and I would understand the big picture enough that I could like figure it out, connect the symbolism, and kind of just make it through. So, I mean, I don't know, I think that's a pretty ADHD thing, but definitely had some funky coping mechanisms always. And so then in high school, I was like really struggling. I couldn't really get by with my kind of sneaky coping mechanisms that I now know are coping mechanisms as well. I was struggling a lot more academically, but like still in the case that I was getting by, I was getting B's, C's, even though I was like failing tests, but then I do all the homework. So then I like got all the points to like get me to this kind of average, fly under the radar. But I was really struggling. I was struggling with depression. I was struggling with anxiety. My anxiety got really bad when I was in high school, like out of control. I felt like I could not function. I couldn't do anything. And it was at that time that, I mean, I was like going at it with my mom all the time. We were like, my room was a mess. Like I could not keep it clean, and just like really struggling with like day-to-day things outside of school, and like the things that my peers were doing, like applying for colleges, was like really not something I even knew how to do or like what to do. And I did have a lot of support, but it became really difficult. And I actually thought, like, I believe it was like my senior year of high school, once I did start getting like treatment for my depression and anxiety, I was seeing a therapist at the time. And I kind of was like, I think independently, I was like, I think I have ADHD. Like I really cannot do a lot of these school things. And at the time I was really just thinking of, kind of the main first thoughts that people think folks with ADHD struggle with, like school, and then when you get older, like work. But I had no awareness of like the emotional regulation, like the kind of greater sensory overwhelm things at the time. So I was just saying, like, I really can't do school. I'm really struggling. I don't know what to do. I tried talking to my mom about it, and like, bless her heart, like she looked at me and was like, well, look, like she looked at me, she looked at my little brother, and she was like, you are not the same. Like he's got ADHD. Like he checks all the boxes. Like, yep. And she was like, I think you're just really depressed and anxious. Like, and then was kind of just like hesitant. And so then I really didn't know. And I obviously didn't know that there were gender differences. I didn't really like look into it too much. It was just one of these like fleeting things. And so then I went to my psychiatrist, and my mom came with me, and we had like a discussion about like, do you have ADHD? And basically they were kind of like, maybe, like, like my mom just kept being like, like, you are not this running around, like you don't have these things, you do not check these boxes, like you're different, you're intense. Like there were these other terms used, but really it kind of was like chalked up to depression, anxiety. The psychiatrist did give me one prescription. Like she was like, well, let's just see how it goes for Ritalin. And I remember I took it like once, maybe twice. And it made me feel so sick. Like I had such bad side effects that I just was like, I can't do this. Like, no. And I never took it again. And then
Was your brother
kind of
medicated?
continued on. He was on and off, but not really ever consistently. He really didn't get a ton of treatment in that realm. I think he's doing a lot more now as he's gotten older, but his support came more in the sense of like, he was transitioned to a smaller private school with much smaller classes and like a lot more teacher attention and teacher focus. Whereas I was, I like to say the guinea pig, I was the oldest. I was enrolled in our bigger public high school where I was a number, not a name. Like teachers didn't really know me that well. And I could fly under the radar. And so that's kind of what I did. And my brother got support in different ways, like academic, changing schools. Whereas I was like a junior at that point. It would have been a lot for me to change schools. And I didn't really want to, honestly. It would have disrupted everything. But yeah, not really, like dabbled in it, tried it, but I don't think he was ever truly medicated in like a consistent way. So yeah, it was fascinating.
Okay. So then, so you went to the psychiatrist and they thought, okay, you might have ADHD, maybe. What then happened?
Yeah, it was kind of like well, we'll give it a shot. Like, I don't know. It was a
right.
bizarre
That's where we were.
interaction to
Sorry, the
start.
Ritalin.
No,
so you
you're
took the
good.
Ritalin and it didn't feel, you made you feel nauseous or
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I went off to college and I was super busy. I moved from Southern California to Denver, Colorado, where I live now, to go to school. And yeah, I just kind of was like thrown into college and kind of forgot about the ADHD thing. I was definitely still struggling with depression, anxiety, but it's really hard to get treatment for that when you're a college student, even on campus. I remember like if they were going to continue prescribing me my antidepressants that I was taking, it was $110 copay every time. And they made you go every like month to check in. And I didn't have the time, didn't have the money. Like that was half my paycheck, so I kind of just stopped, let it all go, powered through college. I definitely like loved my classes. I know that that's like definitely an ADHD thing, but I started studying criminology and within sociology and political science and psychology. And I just got like so sucked in. I loved it. I still love it. I wish I could go back and just do school like that forever, but only take the classes that I want to take and the ones that are interesting to me. And if you look at my GPA for like my Common Core classes, ones you have to take, and then the ones that I chose to take, it's like worlds apart. I mean, you could just see it. It was like C minus C versus like I was doing really well in my other classes.
I could always do that with attendance too, right? Like the classes I loved, I would be there no matter what time of day it was. And then the classes that you could tell I was just like desperately trying not to flunk. I never go to.
Just got by. Exactly. So yeah, that was that. And I definitely like struggled. There's a ton of ways that I could like one of the questions you asked, like, what are some of the things that you look back and see were definitely ADHD? Like in college, I wrote this paper one time. Obviously, I wrote it the night before it was due. I misread the prompt. I missed a key detail that said, like, pick one example and write your paper about this. And I missed that. I picked, I think, 2 or 3, and I structured my paper around like 2 or 3 different things. And the professor, I remember, wrote, like, you didn't follow the prompt. Too bad. It's a really good paper. C. And I just remember being like, what? Like, first I was so mad. I was like, what is he talking about? And then of course I reread the prompt and I'm like, it says 1, like write 1 example. Like, what the heck? Like, what is wrong with me? So there's like a ton of examples like that, that just stand out through college. And, I did make it through. Like, I'm very grateful for that. But yeah, then I guess mid 2020 or beginning of 2020, I was having a lot of trouble like with depression, anxiety, and
I don't know why.
Untreated ADHD amidst general chaos. So yeah, that's kind of where I was like, I'm really struggling. Like, I was stuck in my house all the time. I'm working remote. I do love my job, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just stuck in my house. There is so much going on. Just, it feels like everything's compounding. I had a lot of family stuff going on at the time. And so I was really feeling out of control, like in a way that I hadn't felt since probably high school, when I was at my worst mental health space. And I was like, took a lot of time, took a lot of dealing with insurance and figuring out online like how to get help. But then I got connected with a therapist, and pretty early, like I think at our intake, she kind of was like picking up on some things and was like, have you ever like considered ADHD? Like, and I explained, oh, in high school it was dabbled with, but never really, nothing came of it. She was like, let's just do this quick exam, like this quick assessment. And I mean, I checked literally all the boxes. Like, and even then I still was like, oh, okay. I like continued on. And it wasn't until like a few weeks later where I just was like, oh my gosh, like everything makes sense. Like, this is it. Like, oh my gosh. And she was the one that introduced me to like, look, like women, like femme presenting people, like do a lot to hide this and do a lot to display like these traits differently than men. And that's kind of your stereotype. So that led to my diagnosis. Everything in the world suddenly made sense. I had a full night of like maniacally journaling, just like, and this thing, like recounting my entire life, being like, and this thing happened. Oh my gosh, and the laundry, like, and this, that's why I can't do this thing in the morning. Like I could never do anything in the morning. And I never knew, like, that was a thing. I always was like, I can't work in the morning. Like I can't do it. I need some time to warm up, like more time than other people need. So yeah, that's what led to my diagnosis. And it's honestly changed everything in my life. So
That's amazing. I love hearing
yeah.
stories when a therapist either suggests it or is like fully on board, because I feel like there's so many stories where women are like, no, they think I'm just depressed and anxious. And I was like, if
Yeah.
a therapist is not willing to see the connection between a life of depression and anxiety and being undiagnosed, like then you need a second opinion, because it's just
Yeah.
like, even when you were talking about going with your mom and like that idea that like, well, you don't exhibit these hyperactive symptoms that your brother did, so maybe you're just depressed and anxious. It was like, no, there's no such thing as being just depressed. Like you have to figure out what the source is. And with so many of us, it was this fact that like we felt like we didn't know what was wrong with us, or like you're saying, like I just can't do the thing. And it's not like I don't want to, it's not like I don't feel like it. Like there's a legitimate paralysis there that is really, really difficult to articulate.
Yep. Yeah. And not knowing if like, I'm like, am I making this up? Like, am I lazy? Like, why can't I do this? Just that feeling of like, why can't I do this? Like, what is happening? For
And then
sure. Definitely
also like,
universal.
well, and just, also I think your story is so similar to so many of us in terms of like, it's never noticed in with teachers if you're not being disruptive, right? Which, so if you are not jumping around, if you're not like kicking chairs or doing whatever annoying the teacher, then why would the teacher bother to suggest it or even diagnose it? Like all of those diagnoses in boys when they're kids is because they were disruptive, and so the teacher's like, we need to fix this, we need to make this person less disruptive. And girls are so much more inclined to be likable, right? And to try to like behave. So I thought it was interesting when you told the anecdote about the boy who got in trouble.
Oh, I could think of so many times.
Gender gender stereotyping right there.
Yeah, they're like, oh, you're distracting Raegan. Like she's trying to work. Like now I'm looking back like, oh my gosh, like what did I do?
I know, I didn't even realize that until after my diagnosis, how many times I was separated from the group in elementary school and middle school, where like we'd be in these like desk clusters and my teacher would pull my desk away, or I'd have to sit all by myself, or I'd have to sit next to the teacher's desk as punishment because I was always talking. And I was like, oh, like I never would have remembered that if I hadn't been like thinking back about like what were the signs when I was a kid.
What an isolating feeling too, as a kid, to be like, oh, I've been pulled aside and, I got to sit by the teacher. Like, that's not a good feeling.
Oh, I know. Oh, don't even get me started.
Yeah. Not good.
And then also that stereotype I think we fall into a lot, which is like, you can't possibly have ADHD because you have good grades, or like this reinforcement of the stereotype that ADHD only happens to people who are like a total hot mess on the outside and, demonstrably a hot mess. Whereas so many of us do really well in school and so many of us do really well in our jobs. And we actually are quite high functioning. And so people say you can't possibly have ADHD, and you're like, no, you don't understand. Like, that's what you're seeing. That's just the iceberg, like the iceberg analogy of just like, you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. I really felt that even when I was given the diagnosis, like I had so much doubt of like, is this a thing that I'm putting on for myself? Like, am I just saying that I have ADHD to like make myself feel better, like say that, this isn't my fault, and to like dismiss that blame. And, really like, I think I brought that to my therapist. She was like, Raegan, I think she could tell I was spiraling in the way that like we ADHDers do, where we're like minimizing our own stuff. She was like,
absolutely.
If it helps, I'm a professional here. Like, you have ADHD. You don't need to say that you're putting this on yourself. Like, this is a confirmed thing, so we can like move on. And kind of that like validation just helped so much to be like, you are not crazy. Like, this is real. Don't talk yourself out of it. Like, don't minimize what you've gone through and what is real.
Yeah, right. I try to remind myself of that all the time, which like that impulse to self-doubt, that constant questioning, and then the subsequent minimizing, like that is the ADHD talking, all of that.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, how it is.
Okay, so now you talked a little bit about how life has changed since your diagnosis. I feel like we have that, emotional roller coaster of like, oh my God, this explains everything. But then also followed by like, wait a minute, I'm still in isolation. I'm still in the pandemic. I still can't work in the morning, or all of these like ways in which you now have to kind of manage what you now understand as ADHD. How do you feel like life has changed for you since your diagnosis?
Yeah, it's changed a lot, honestly, just having that awareness, like being able to tap in and recognize like what is happening as it's happening. Specifically with like being overstimulated has helped me so much, recognizing like, I would come over to my partner's house after a long day, and I'd get to his place and he's watching like a football game or a game, and I'm trying to talk to him, and like the game is on in the background, and like the dog is running around and we're trying to figure out dinner, and I would just like freak out sometimes. And then he'd be like, what is like, are you good? And I was like, it's loud. Like, but I never really knew why that was the case. And so it was hard for both of us. And now I guess recognizing that, like, I'm able to be like, oh, okay, like I can support him in doing the things that he wants to do, and like remove myself, or even have that anticipation of like, this might be a little overwhelming and I know why. And I can use that to kind of like better mediate the situation to prevent me from getting past that threshold. That's been really helpful with like the emotional regulation piece, and just knowing I get stressed when there's weird noises. I can't talk when the TV's on, or, this or that is happening. That has helped immensely. I'll also say I am now medicated, not with the Ritalin that made me sick, but it has helped so much. And
what are you taking instead?
Yeah, I take Vyvanse now.
Okay.
And it's been much better, much better. I had a lot of support from my psychiatrist and my therapist, which has really helped me, because I had a lot of apprehensions about taking this medication. I think that's another thing, like growing up and being the age that I am, and growing up when I grew up, like I had such a stigma around medications, and I still have some anxiety, but I like to think it's a healthy anxiety. But but just growing up and being like, seeing my peers abusing this, like this, yeah, I'm hearing it in the news and you're seeing articles on like that this medication is being abused and it's being over administered. And, I don't really know the details on all that, but I know that I saw my peers in college and even high school, like abusing this medication and using it to like become like a superhero and all this stuff. And so I was like very scared to take it, as like always been a rule follower, and also knowing I can be really impulsive of like, is this what I really want to introduce in my life? Like, what type of like crutch is this going to be? And how could this like spiral out and create more problems in my life when I don't want that?
Yeah. Well, and
But it's
also we
helped
have
so
addictive
much.
personalities and tend to self-medicate.
Exactly. I've never smoked a cigarette because I know I cannot smoke a cigarette. You know what I
There's
mean?
not
Like
just one. Yeah.
I've never let myself do it once. And so I definitely have that addictive personality that I think is quite not alone in that. But really like talking with those professionals and understanding like this is like true support, like people take medication for all different reasons, like working through that stigma, knowing that I like have professionals supporting me who like they're gonna know if things go out of hand, like that's their job. They've got my back, and like that feels really good, just to lessen that personal anxiety. And then also like I believe it was my therapist was like, look, Raegan, like even if you want to take this if you take this for a year, that's what you decide is the best thing. Like really the goal is to like have enough space in your brain to build the tools, to build the practices and like the coping mechanisms and strategies that are going to be healthy. And if you use this to support you through that, then we could revisit. Like obviously I can always decide to stop or change. I have tons of agency in that way, but just being like, look, after a year, you can say, I don't want to take this medication anymore. And you're probably still going to be way better off because like I'm working with this therapist, we're working on skills, we're working on that regulation, and like having the space to implement and actually build these practices into habits has been so helpful. So that's definitely changed in a really good way.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great perspective too. Because I feel like my I've talked about this with other guests. My history with antidepressants was always sort of feeling I would get trapped in that cycle of like, this medication doesn't feel like it's working, so let's up the dose. And then I would have that constant questioning, which is like, okay, if this is how bad I feel on the medication, imagine how bad I'll feel off the medication. Exactly. And so then I have to keep upping the dose and never being like, maybe this is the wrong medication. But just, I guess, always feeling like so much mental real estate was taken up wondering if the medication was working. And then I'd be like, you know what, maybe it's just easier to go off everything and start from start from scratch and like what's my baseline. And so I like the fact that you are the hand holding that you're getting from your therapist, and just in terms of like, this medication is supposed to free up that mental space as opposed to making it feel even more crowded, which is what I sometimes think medication does.
Yep. I had the same experience when I was in college taking antidepressants as well too, like very much the same. And I was just like, I'm done for like a lot of reasons, like the finances were some, the time, the energy, all of it. I was just like, I can't do this. I stopped, and it was what I had to do at that time. And I think it really, got me to where I am now, but I do wish I had more support at that time.
Well, and then you think about, the quote unquote abuse of stimulants, right? In college, especially, and how it's gotten this reputation of being this controlled substance and it's so expensive. And like the way in which it seems to be splintering off from like SSRIs and antidepressants. Like when like antidepressants are so easy to get, they're like pennies a bottle compared to the expense that so many of us, especially in the US, are experiencing with these with stimulants, right? Like it blows my mind the hurdles that we have to go through in order to get this medication, and the overwhelming expense so many of us have to have this medication like, I don't know what I'm getting at. I guess just the stigma that is rising with stimulants. And it's the stigma is from the fact that it's being abused, right? And I don't think it's necessarily being abused. I think it's just being used in
Absolutely.
like in a way in which, like, if it was more available, if it was more widely available, or if young people understood the, what was happening, and that this was helpful to them, like,
Yes.
you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like I'm
No,
not
I
articulating it well, where I'm like,
absolutely
nobody's
understand.
abusing it.
The narrative is what I had always held and
Yeah.
seen as being so problematic. Like you're absolutely right.
But you're right. We fear it. We
It's
think it's
that
like
scarcity.
cocaine.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And even just thinking like of being on a college campus and how various drugs are more or less acceptable, like the social implications of that, like the racial implications, the
Mm,
history of different medications and where they come about and who is allowed to have what is fascinating to me. But just the narrative was a big thing. Just growing up and being like, oh, that's like meth, like they're giving kids meth. And that's what I grew up hearing. So then it's like, I'm in high school struggling and I'm like, I don't want to take meth. Like, what? That's not going to help me.
mhm.
And having to really unpack that and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, this is not where we are. This is not what it is. And that was definitely the case.
Yeah. Hmm. All right. So then, yeah, what other kind of observations do you have in terms of Gen Z, millennial, I guess you're still millennial, right?
Yeah.
Gen Z
I
is still
don't
younger.
know.
I
I'm
feel
on the
like millennial
cusp.
is a huge category.
I know I'm on the cusp. I was born in 96. So I never know where I fall in that, but I'm definitely straddling a weird line. I think really that the gender difference comes with just omitting in what we think about ADHD as, just omitting the like emotional regulation, omitting the non like school and work pieces are the things. Like I see it as like, I don't know how to articulate this, but just when you're struggling in like school or you're struggling in work for some reason, like that is much more accepted and like validated
Mm,
than struggling with those emotional and like interpersonal kinds of things. And I think in a lot of ways, like that has led to, I mean, there's a ton of reasons why men are diagnosed more than women, but I think it's like, oh, if there's a man struggling with work or with school, like that's a big problem. We need to be sure that that person is getting a lot of support. Not really considering like, that of course men have emotional regulation problems too, and those are valid and need to be treated as well. And then we have women on the other side who we're going to go through way greater lengths to still succeed in these academic and like traditionally male masculine dominated spaces. We're doing a lot more to get through and to be seen as successful, but when we're struggling with our mental health, like that is not that's not validated. That's oh, you're depressed or you're anxious, and there's not this urgency of like, oh my gosh, why are all of these women struggling, why are all these people struggling? And it's really like what we as a society prioritize. And that's doing well in school, that's doing well in work, and really is dismissive of the fact that we're all people with like very wide scopes of life, and we're more than our like capitalistic output. We have merit in and of ourselves, and our health and our well-being, and that healing is so important. So I think that's kind of a big thing that I've seen just in those gender differences.
yeah. And I think, your generation has the crippling student debt,
Absolutely.
which, so you have that butting up against the overwhelming pressure to like succeed in your 20s. And because you're seeing all of these like social media influencers and TikTok
Mhm.
influencers who are, making piles of money at such a young age. And I feel like there's the pressure is much greater on your generation in terms of like success at a young age,
Mhm.
when the it's just impossible. I mean, like you still have to get a college education, but then you end up with crippling debt for the rest of your life as a
Yeah.
result. And
Yeah.
um but there's still that pressure that you have to like live by yourself and have all of these accommodations, like having, the
Mhm.
great house and car and career
Yeah.
that just aren't available to you anymore. And yet
Yeah.
it's the reality just doesn't reflect the dream in a way that I think
Not
didn't
at all.
exist for my generation at all.
Yeah, and the stakes are higher. I mean, like you said, like you come out of college with all this debt. I have debt, and most of my peers have debt. And it's this, all right, you got 6 months before you're going into repayment. Like, what are you gonna do? You better get on that. Like, better find a job. And there's not a ton of great job opportunities. There's not a ton of resources for finding that. And you are just pushed really hard, really fast into like real adult world, and the stakes are really high. You now have loans, you now have all of these things. You rent is astronomically high, and we're way underpaid as like a generation. And just looking at inflation, looking at how we as a generation are doing, like the stakes are really high, and it's very hard. It's really hard. People don't know what to do. They feel lost, and then we're in the middle of an environmental crises. And I know a lot of young people, a lot of people my age, neurotypical or neurodivergent, are feeling really compelled to move to work that they are passionate about, and unfortunately that work doesn't often pay very well.
Mhm.
So stakes are definitely higher as well.
Yeah, that's nothing new. I I
No,
remember,
it's not.
but I do remember feeling like having this realization with my teenager recently, where I was like, your generation is really the first who doesn't know if you're going to make it to adulthood. Like I sort of feel like there's this
Absolutely.
nihilism, that's in in all of your life decisions, right? Like I'm like, why have children? What is it? We're destroying the earth. Like there's an imminency to the earth, to
Absolutely.
the destruction of the earth that didn't exist when I was in my teens and 20s.
Yep.
And so, there was always that question of like, do I have children? Do I not? And we had
Mhm.
obviously, as women, had a lot more opportunities to, there was less pressure to sort of be a
Mhm.
housewife and any of that. But like, I feel like with a much younger generation, like this is really the first time where you face all of your life decisions with the sense of like, we may or may not make it,
Oh,
and
it's
like, how does
so
that
true.
even, like, I was thinking of this out loud with my teenager, and then I stopped
Mhm.
myself and I was like, God, am I like destroying, like, I was like, should I even not mention this? Am I a bad mother if I'm even mentioning that this reality exists? But like, I was like, how does that even affect any, of the way you approach decisions, like how does it approach saving money, why bother, how does it approach like
Yeah.
working towards anything, with that looming sense in the background of always just being like, well, we're fucked anyway, so what's the point?
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
like,
And
feels
I
like that defines their generation. Yeah.
It does. And I don't know like how much of this is like ADHD. I do think I suspect some of it, but like I get pretty infatuated with like these thought loops, that rumination of like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Like, what am I doing? Seeing that bigger systems connect, I think for me and just my passions has been both a blessing and a curse, because I feel like it's really propelled me to like push myself, get out of my comfort zone, like do more and like be better. But it also is this like very heavy weight to carry, is like having so much pressure that you put on yourself, and trying really hard to step back and not putting the weight of the world on yourself, and knowing that I will never as an individual like right the wrongs and make life what am I trying to say, that like justice, liberation, those like humanity components, they're not my, I cannot do that. I cannot right those wrongs as an
Mhm.
individual. That does not mean that I can be complacent. There are absolutely things that I can do. And so it's definitely this like give and take of like, I am deeply passionate, I care so deeply, but then also being like, sometimes I'm like, I can't do this anymore. Like it's too much, like I work in a nonprofit space, working to get young people engaged in politics, and really, it's incredible. I couldn't do anything else. Like I'm so deeply passionate about it, and I feel very lucky to have a job that I like care so deeply for, and get to connect with like really amazing. My coworkers are amazing, like-minded peers, who push me. But it's also, I know we all really do struggle with like, it's heavy stuff. It's not, we care deeply, and that's why we do this work. So it has mental health implications as well, for sure.
Oh yeah, and I think that that is something you constantly, like you said, you're constantly writing that. At what point is it too much? At what point do I really have to start thinking about self-preservation versus, helping others and doing the work that not a lot of other people are able to or willing to do? And so feeling that calling, but also realizing that somehow that calling is leading to a sense of self-destruction that you feel like you're
Absolutely.
implicit in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
just
that
that
savior
over,
complex too,
yeah,
of
I
like,
know, right? Oh my God. There's so many
I
interesting
think
elements.
we feel that
I
pretty
think we
heavy
do. And I
as
think, and I
empathetic
think
people.
I think because we are, yeah, because we think really, really deeply, and I think we are like really run by our emotions. Like I love having a positive spin on ADHD, and I think there's so many wonderful qualities about it, but it is not a superpower. Like it just drives me crazy when people like are dismiss the emotional gravity of life with
Absolutely.
ADHD and are sort of like, no, this is the greatest thing that ever happened to you. And like that toxic positivity just drives me crazy. And I certainly don't feel like, well, then you have to swing in the opposite direction and talk about how it's like it's a disorder and we need to take it
Absolutely.
seriously. But because that bothers me too. But I just
Yeah.
feel like it's so nuanced, and that's why I feel like we kind of are figuring it out one conversation at a time, right? Of just being like,
Uh-huh.
what is happening and how do we deal with this? And,
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely, oh, sorry, my
that's
dog
okay.
has a lot of thoughts right now. Can I go shush her really quick?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, someone walked
Okay.
by.
That's the beauty of
Um,
podcasting. You just cut it all out.
I love that. Well, what I was just thinking is like, I think you're right that that's such a toxic approach. I mean, I know I definitely have skills. I have things about ADHD that I definitely like and make me a better person. But I think a lot of that comes from like, we really got to step back on that one and think about everyone's like power and privilege and the identities we hold and the space that we grew up in and the ways that we can succeed. And I know for me, like I am both, I'm very grateful, but I'm also very aware of like how my identity and my privilege growing up like really did help me succeed and get to the uh space that I'm in now. And that, you could look at me and say, oh, you're successful, you're like a successful person. And the metric that we use is just, it's so rooted in like what export we put out, like how productive we are for society. And even in school, like really marking students for things that are, just training them to be good workers and get things done, and productivity and the output and this and not about the means, not about how we're doing it, what we're getting there. And so like, I mean, I think, yeah, there's definitely a bunch of skills. I've also struggled very greatly, but I grew up where my parents could afford to send me to tutoring and they would help me. And my brother could get put into a private school because they could afford that. I grew up in a pretty moderately wealthy, like white suburban home. And like, how did that, when I had those really impulsive outbursts and I got in trouble in a, bigger way than just being reactive in class or something, I was given a pass because, I'm like, oh, she's like a cute white woman. She's like a sweet, like all these things we put on women, and we put on whiteness, and we put on the passes that we give to people because of their identities. Like, I do think, I hate hearing that, like, oh, it's a superpower, because I just think like how much of that mindset comes from
the
being able,
accommodations that you had in your life. Yeah,
that
absolutely.
other people don't have. And I just think we kind of need to step back on that and be like, okay, we all work hard. That's true. We all are struggling, but like some of us have different tools and different resources. And I think that gets minimized when you start talking about that, that approach.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, so one thing I like to ask my guests is if you could rename ADHD to something that's a little less confounding or problematic. Have you thought about what you would
Yeah.
what would you might call it?
Yes, I have. And I've thought about this like even before this question was posed, because I've never really felt like that ADHD like label fits. I mean, it does in a million ways, but it also doesn't. Um, I don't have a name, I will say, but I wrote down regulation because I think that's a key thing. I think that's a key misunderstanding and a misconsensus. And I think something that has to do with processing, something that has to do with regulation. I think those are that's the direction I would go for renaming it, because I know I don't have a deficit of attention. Like, you know, I really don't. It's just that I can't regulate it. I can't get myself always to do what I know needs to be done, or even sometimes I don't remember what I need to be doing that needs to be done. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than not having that focus piece. Yeah.
Well, and like you said, it really doesn't hit home until you start factoring in, or once you start really understanding the emotional aspects and the sensory processing, right? Where you're like, those were the two things that really hit home for me. So the fact that neither sensory or emotional is mentioned in the DSM or even in the name itself, I find just sends people down the wrong rabbit holes.
Yeah. I kind of want to ask you, like, because I know you've heard this answer from so many people. Like, what do you think? And I'll add, like, do you think that that drive and that curiosity and that different way, like that big picture thinking that ADHD folks have, like, how could that be represented in that name? What do you think? Have you
Right? I
heard
don't know.
anything?
I know. I don't have a good one, and I whenever I'm
I don't
asked, I'm like,
know.
I don't know. I feel like it always comes back to the dopamine for me. Like I feel like so
Okay.
much of this is the result of dopamine seeking, right? And so I feel like even just the term dopamine deficiency kind of really like neatly explains everything.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand how that manifests, dopamine deficiency is just going to be as confusing as attention deficit. Like you're just sort of like, I don't have a
For
dopamine
sure.
deficiency. Like it really takes that obsessive research and hyper focus for you to understand the different ways in which a dopamine deficiency exists for us.
Yep.
Right. So
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like, at the end of the day, it's really just all about the dopamine. AATD, all about the dopamine. Or,
Yes.
like Connor
That's so
DeWolf,
good.
right? Or Connor DeWolf's like follow the dopamine. Like
Yeah.
it's just that sense. Like I think it really comes down to that. But again, if somebody suggests to you like maybe the root of all of your issues is dopamine deficiency, I don't know if that would really like connect the dots for anyone. So I can't, like, I'm like, I think, you know, that book that's called like, you mean I'm not crazy, lazy,
Mhm.
or stupid, it's ADHD. I think that's another one where I'm like, God, yeah, that's a huge revelation for many of us. But
Yeah.
again, like, I don't know, it is so much all at once. It really it I don't know if we're going to ever be able to package it into like one neat little acronym.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true. I think you're right though. And one of the things that looking back when I was diagnosed, I was like, I have always, when I am bored, I feel painfully bored. I hate being bored. And like, that was one of those things that clicked later. I was like, oh, I get it. That's the dopamine deficiency thing. But I always tried to explain that like to my mom or to people around me, like, I hate being bored. And they're like, it's good for you. Like rest your mind. It's good. I'm like, this is not good for me. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I like am in pain right now. I can't do anything. And there's no way this is good for me. Like boredom is not the thing. I don't know how to chill. Like, what do
Oh,
I
I know,
do?
right? Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, the other thing about like really being able to talk about the paralysis, because,
Mm-hmm.
for me, I never reacted to the hyper, or I never related to the hyperactivity element because I could lie around doing nothing. I feel like most of my life was
Yes.
me lying
Yep.
around not doing the thing I'm supposed to do. And I was like,
Oh
that
my
felt like the
gosh.
exact opposite of hyperactivity. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of talk about the um, the way in which paralysis relates to and interacts with hyperactivity, because I have yet to interview a woman who wasn't hyperactive in some way or form in her head, right? um, and how your hyperactivity and the overthinking and the like self-doubt, like all of that hyperactivity
Yes.
internally then ends up looking like paralysis. And
Uh-huh.
so I think that's been such an important like distinction in my own mind, that there's a
Yeah.
real difference between laziness and paralysis. And like,
Absolutely.
being able to define that for myself has helped, like the way you said, like it's nice to have that narrator in the margins that's like, okay, this is why you are reacting, because there's too many sounds happening and you're getting a little
Yeah.
ragey. And you can have that explainer that follows you around and kind of hovers around and is like, this is what is happening and this is why.
Yes.
And yeah, so I don't remember, I lost my
Mm-hmm.
train of thought, but
That's all right. Well, when you lost yours, I came up with a new one. So
good.
what you were just saying made me think of how another difference, I guess, in my age, which was like growing up with technology and the internet and that dependency of the internet and my phone from I don't want to say like very young. I know there's like a newer generation that's like 6 months old on their phone. And I was certainly not ever that, but
Hmm.
definitely being a teenager and being like, I can't get off my computer. I'm like compulsively like going through this loop. And I still do that. Um, Absolutely. Even medicated, I don't think I'll ever be able to break that paralysis fully. But having that and not knowing what it was in high school was very hard of like, I know that I need to do XYZ things right now. I can't get off Facebook.
Yeah.
Like I would just, and now I'm trying really hard to recognize and step back, get off. I'm off Facebook. Like I'm trying to get off Instagram and knowing that those things are coping mechanisms for that dopamine burst and trying desperately to fill that. Definitely was a great distraction for me in high school to keep me from the things that I should have been doing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I did when I was a kid. That's the other weird thing about ADHD is I have such a shitty memory when it comes to my
Oh,
childhood.
same.
So I'm like,
Same.
what did I do when I was bored? I remember listening to records a lot and like
Oh,
coming
yeah.
up with like plays. We would always me and my neighbor would always like come up with performances and plays and stuff. So I'm like, maybe it is just about this new generation that has their phone all the time and they're just not allowing themselves to get bored. But maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
You still feel bored. I mean, I'll tell you, I can get stuck in those loops and it's like, it's that paralysis where I'm like, I am bored. I'm doing this because I don't know what else to do and I can't get myself to stop. But like, it's not a good feeling when you're stuck in that. Like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, like from Reddit to Instagram to whatever, like it is painful still. It's definitely like a coping thing, trying to like break out of it, but it's can be really, really, really hard.
Yeah,
Sure.
I know. And then I think about the like performative element too, like with TikTok, and the fact that when I was a
Mhm.
kid, we performed for the 5 people in our living room. Like now there is social media and
Yep.
I don't know, that's a whole other conversation. I like
Yep.
make it hurts my brain when I think about what social media is doing to
Absolutely.
to our sense of
Absolutely.
self and our sense of just like requiring likes and requiring
Yes.
feedback and requiring approval and all of
The
that stuff that
validation,
that
exactly.
right that I feel so grateful that I did not grow up with that as being so central to my identity, because I feel like it is destroying young
Yes.
people. I sound so old
I
right
think it's
now, but I
so, I
do,
know,
like I feel like it's
I do
just
too. I'm like, I'm 25 and I'm like, because it for me, that was really introduced when I was in late middle school, high school, pretty,
when you're so
pretty
vulnerable.
developmental like times. And we really didn't like know the implications, or maybe some people do. I didn't know. I was just in high school. And I think now of like really like the younger generation. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could not have handled that in elementary school,
Mm.
middle school. I really can't handle it now. Like it's frightening, truly. I do get worried. But that is
Yeah,
another topic.
I know, right? But I feel like you guys are you'll be like a good ongoing social experiment to see,
Oh
what
yeah.
it, if you ever outgrow it, or if you ever kind of like level off in terms of
Yeah,
that,
that's true.
because you see, it just feels like you can get caught up in that tornado so quickly of feeling like all of your self-worth is wrapped up
Yes.
in the validation of social media,
Yes.
and it feels like at some point you need to get over it, right? But
It's very isolating, but it's really hard. Yeah, stepping back from social media has been a really important thing for me, like mental health wise. It just was too much. And I think I'm better off. And also like I hate being I like to be in the moment with people, when I'm with folks, like there's no pictures of me that I've taken from the past like 8 years, because when I'm with people, I forget my phone exists and I'm like bouncing around, and I never stop to be like, oh, let's take a picture, like that. I think requires a little bit too much executive function and agency for me, to be honest. Like I'm in that conversation. I'm thinking about whatever we're doing. And so I always think that's kind of funny after the fact, but I'm like, I just did this really cool thing and there's not one single photo because I didn't even think to take my phone out, or
I
like
love
pause
that.
and be like, hey, let's take a picture. This is so cute. This is a great, great memory. So there's definitely a few sides to that coin.
That's such a great point too, because it never occurs to me to ever take pictures of my kids when we're doing things, and then I always feel like I'm a bad mom because I never took
Mm-hmm.
pictures. But you're right, like that is a great quality about ADHD. We are fully invested in the
Uh-huh.
moment, which makes us such great conversationalists.
Yep.
We're not great at remembering each other's birthdays, but
Nope.
when I am with you, I am like fully, like I'm
Yes.
all about you, and I think that can be, it has its benefits and its um no, it has its benefits. I was going to say it's
It
like has
does.
its,
No, it
it
does.
can also be has its negatives, but I was like, no, I think it's a great quality for us, and I think no,
You
you're right,
can't
it's
fake it.
nice. You can't
You
fake it,
cannot fake it. So
but it's
if
good that
I'm
we're not
talking to someone, like they know they've got my attention, or they don't and they know,
right. Yeah,
there's
that's
no
true. I
hiding
can't
it.
pretend you're interesting. uh
Yeah, no, there is none of that, definitely.
Cool. All right. Well, I so appreciate your perspective, and I'm so glad we had this conversation. So thank you for reaching out, Raegan. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad that the conversations on the podcast are helping multiple generations of women too, because that still blows my mind
Yeah.
all the time that anyone is even listening.
No, it really is so nice. I listen to this podcast like very, very regularly. I have to say, I listen to it on 1.5 speed, which I don't know if anyone else with ADHD does that, but it helps me like keep it going. So,
Oh, I do too.
but I love listening to your podcast, and I've always like really related to so much, and it's been really helpful. It's always interesting hearing folks talking about kids and child raising, and I'm always just like, oh, like okay, like I'll cross that bridge when we get there. But good to have the foresight, just
I know,
seems
right?
I don't do well
Sometimes,
on low sleep. So
well, I know sometimes I feel like I'm scaring people away from parenthood because we talk about it like it's such a nightmare. But I feel like it's a nightmare when you're undiagnosed. And I feel like
it's
that's what I mean.
it's
Like
real
if
too.
I could, I mean, it is, it's hard. I'm not going
It's
to sugarcoat
hard.
it,
It's hard for
but
everyone. It's
it's
hard.
hard. And we are such good parents for so many reasons that
Absolutely.
I think it's absolutely like I don't want anyone to feel like they should fear parenthood because of ADHD. I think we make amazing parents, but also like I feel like God, it would have been such a different experience if I had known what the hell was going on in my brain, especially on the
Oh,
when I
for
wasn't
sure.
sleeping.
Yeah, I mean, and it definitely like it's helped me be like, okay, this is something I really will need to think about. I mean, especially with like ADHD being potentially slash likely. I don't know what the scientific consensus is, but there's a genetic component for sure.
Mhm.
So knowing that, I think it's better to have more information and like be informed and make a big picture decision for something so important.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. I do appreciate it. I really like it. I don't know. I just like, oh, I'm 25. I'm still figuring it out. Not that anybody has it figured out, but I'm like, uh,
No,
we're in the
I know.
middle
And
of it right now.
I love thinking about how by the time you're 45, how much more will we know about
Yeah,
about neurodiversity and how many more accommodations will we see in the classrooms
absolutely.
or in our workplaces? And hopefully this
Absolutely.
pandemic and working from home has blown up a bit of that like 9 to 5 narrative that so many of us struggled with so much. And that,
Hmm.
it'll leave open this idea that like everybody has their own productivity windows and everybody works
Yes.
differently and we can
Yes.
accommodate for all of those. There's not like
Absolutely.
that industrialized worker mentality.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Of course. You're preaching to the choir here.
Awesome. All right, well, I will look forward to seeing how it goes over the next 20 years, but in the
Thank you. Me
meantime,
too. A little bit
thank
of eminent doom mixed with we'll see what happens. We're rolling with it. So
awesome. All right, well, thanks
I
again, Raegan. It
appreciate
was
it.
lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, take care. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.